Good afternoon. I wanted to talk about some of the most common, most prevalent issues that I found in the drafts, just because I find that sometimes it's a whole lot easier to listen to somebody discuss these instead of reading a long post having to do with them. The first one of these is actually a matter that we've been thinking about and discussing ever since the very beginning of this project. That is the status of the author of a piece of literature. Think of it like this: once the author finishes writing that piece of literature, that person might as well never be heard from again. Now, I don't wish any authors any ill will. Certainly, it's a good thing for those people to be lifelong members of society who contribute to the active art scene of the particular moment in history. What I mean, though, is that once the piece of literature has been written and published, really it no longer matters what the author meant to put in it. What's in it is what's there, and that's all there is to it. This goes back to the video that we all watched on the intentional fallacy. Remember that a fallacy is a problematic way of thinking. In this case, the intentional fallacy refers to the way of analyzing literature that tries to guess at whatever the author meant to put there. We don't have access to the author, and by extension, we don't have access to that person's intentions. And that's exactly why that way of interpreting literature just doesn't work. Next, I found myself responding to a lot of title formatting issues and inconsistencies. Remember, a short story is a shorter part of something larger. Usually, short stories are published in collections. So the short story has its title in quotation marks. Meanwhile, the larger collection that the short story was probably part of, the title of that larger collection, that's the thing that would be in italics, right? So the larger thing with smaller parts, italics, the smaller part of something larger, quotation marks. I did find myself remarking upon tense often. I think we're all trying to figure out exactly what tense to write about this in. Consider the fact that even though in most short stories chronological order is used, mostly, the way that the events of a short story exist for us, they're all there on the page, right? And so as a result, we refer to all of those events in present tense because they continue to be there on the page in the literature. The only time that we would want to go to a past tense is if we're referring to events that happen in the prehistory of the short story. By prehistory, I mean those things that happen before the story itself, the things that we didn't read about, but we might hear characters referring to. In terms of other things that I think we're all trying to figure out the best way of doing, in terms of citing and citations, the short version of this is we don't have to do a lot of it. As long as we've established who the author is and what the piece of literature is at the beginning of our essay, there is no need to cite the author every time you reference an event or give a quotation, right? That's been established and it's not going to change because we're only talking about one author and one short story. So again, we don't need to cite each of those things every single time we mention them or make use of them. Next, I wanted to talk a little bit about the way that critical approach decides relevance. Consider the story of an hour, which many of you wrote about. Now, the story of an hour and the analytical question on it ask you to apply some psychoanalysis as well as gender criticism. And so you'll spend time looking at the way that the mental states and motivations of the characters go hand in hand with the societally constructed gender that the characters have to show us a short story in which the gender roles are just as much a driving factor as anything else, right? What that means is that those critical approaches actually work to determine what details are relevant to our analysis. Meanwhile, if I wanted to, I could talk about the fact that there are indicators that the Mallards are of the upper class, but that doesn't really fit the critical approaches I'm using. So even though it might be true, it's not relevant to the analysis. Speaking of relevance and gauging relevance, I'd like to talk a little bit about summary here. Summary only has a place in what we write if it's in service to some point we're making. Summary for its own sake is just never relevant. I realize that I'm stating that quite strongly, but we've got to make sure we remember it's the case. Again, summary for its own sake, never relevant, but summary that's been carefully chosen to help us support the points we're making, that's what we want. That's what we want to have in our essays. From there, I wanted to make a couple of comments having to do with different critical approaches that I'm seeing people applying and maybe having a little bit of confusion over. First is the distinction between historicism and new historicism. The distinction is this. Historicism says that history can explain literature to us. Well, sometimes it can. For example, if you found yourselves writing about In the Land of the Free by Suisun Far, then you probably would have had to establish early in your essay the fact that that's taking place in the early 20th century. And as a result, the historical moment will help to explain things like why it is that there is an anti Chinese sentiment that drives the events of the short story. That's about as far as we can go, though. Whereas new historicism holds that actually the relationship is the opposite, where history can't necessarily tell us that much about the literature has the potential to tell us quite a bit about what it was like to be alive at that moment. Right? So that's the big difference between the two. The question is what's explaining what? For historicism, history is explaining the literature. For new historicism, the literature is explaining what it was like to be alive at that moment in history. And that's the reason that critics have turned towards new historicism as the richer, more useful one of those critical approaches. Next, take a look at the critical approach of psychoanalysis. This is one where we really need the tools in order to be able to do it correctly. And that's exactly the reason that I've left a link for lots of you who are trying to apply this in the comments on your draft to a more detailed discussion of this at the Purdue OWL website. It's the same link that's available in the extra materials on the critical approaches that there's a link to in the assignment guidelines. Please take me up, read that over. It'll give you some additional theoretical tools that will make your application of that critical approach much, much more useful. Next, we come to post-structuralism and deconstruction. These are things that people have written entire books about. Suffice it to say, post-structuralism does indeed stress the fact that there's no fixed meaning in a text, but that's because of the fact that the meaning comes from all of us and we're always changing. As individuals, we change often day to day, month to month, year to year. Obviously, we grow and mature and look at the things we read differently depending on what stage of life we're in. But that also has to do with historical fact. We might write a book, for example, on, say, national origins and how important it is to be proud of one's country and national heritage. And depending on what moment in history we're in, that's actually going to mean something different. Right? Even as recently as 20 years ago, that might not have had such a resonance here in the United States, but we might have found, say, a sociologist or a political scientist applying that sort of work to, say, the Balkans and the way that different national identities in that region of the world were continuing to cause the war that was going on. Whereas, if that hypothetical piece of literature were written now, the significances of it would be quite a lot different because we're in a country that's trying to figure out exactly how we understand national identity and how comfortable we are with attitudes of nationalism, right? So where we're looking at post-structuralism and deconstruction as saying that the text doesn't have any real meaning, yes, it says that, but again, that's because we're looking at the meaning of the text as determined, by the historical moment, by the context that it's in, right? If we just take that fact that deconstruction isn't supposed to have a meaning and only run with that, we actually find ourselves getting into reader response criticism. And that's one that I've chosen to kind of sidestep just because that's even more difficult to apply in a careful and thorough way. Lastly, I wish I could just list all of the different formulations of this because there are a lot of them, but I'll mention the two that I've seen most often. There is no deeper meaning of a text. There is nothing to be found if we're reading between the lines of the text. We don't have to dig deeper. We don't have to look for what the real meaning is. None of those things matter. They don't really exist. What I've said to most of you, if I did happen to find a statement like that in your draft, is that there's no such thing as an example of a deeper meaning. There's no such thing as, for example, reading between the lines. There is only what we're looking for and what we find. That's it. It might have originally seemed like we were finding some deeper meaning, but that's only because we didn't have the critical tools that we have now. The meaning was always there. It was just a question of how we were looking for it.